Welcome, everyone. My name is Julia Toothacre, and I am the career coach and strategist behind Ride the Tide Collective, the podcast, and the company. This is a career-focused podcast that helps ambitious professionals strategize and take action to control their career in a way that aligns with their personality and their values. This season, I am embracing the collective part of my company name, and I've invited various coaches and experts to talk about topics that impact career development and decisions. Except for this episode and one other, where I am actually going to be doing a few solo episodes talking about some sensitive topics that I think just warrant me coming on and talking about my experience and giving some base information. So in this particular episode, we are going to be talking about death. I know. Estate planning and caregiving. Part of the reason that I didn't bring anybody on for this episode, like a lawyer or something like that, is because these are topics that are widely different in every state. They're handled different in every state. The cost to do different types of services is very different depending on the state that you live in. So I wanted to share kind of my general experience and things that I have learned along the way from my personal experience, but also just from my lawyer and from other people who have been in similar situations to me. And I think it's going to be like very informative, but I'm going to be honest with you, it's going to be difficult. These topics are not easy to talk about. If you've been around the podcast for a while, you know that I don't shy away from talking about my parents' death. But I think getting into some of the nuances of what happened is something else. And so this episode is going to give you a lot of things to think about around the three areas that I mentioned. One of the things that I want you to consider, if you are on the younger side and you have older parents, this is probably going to be a good episode for them to learn about what can happen if they don't take certain precautions, and just learn from what I wish my parents would have done in some circumstances. And ultimately, I think what I want to get across to everyone is these are topics that need to be talked about. Even if you don't want to talk about them, they are hard topics, especially as you are getting older. But they are so important to have. They're so important to think through because honestly, it's really not fair to leave that to the next generation to try to figure out. So what I am going to be doing in this episode, we're talking about the three different areas: death, estate planning, and caregiving. I am going to talk about some high-level things. So this conversation is going to be more introductory, and I'm going to give you some things that I want you to think about and why I think you need to think about them. I'm not going to go into too much detail for a couple of reasons. One, like I said, these are very hard topics. And when you get too detailed with it, it can be extremely overwhelming because my guess is for most of you, you have not had these conversations. You have not breached these topics with yourself, with possibly a significant other, or with family members. So I want to give you some of the basics. And then I think you need to take that and do research on your own about the different topics and what's available to you within your situation. All right, let's talk about preparing for death. This is probably one of the most uncomfortable conversations that you will ever have, whether it's yourself, with a spouse, or with a family member. It is very hard to think about death and dying and what that could look like. I'm going to give a caveat here that estate planning is typically part of this conversation, but because of the nuance of estate planning, I'm pulling that out into its own section. So one of the first things that I want you to think about is long-term care and medical insurance. And long-term care is something that not everybody will need, but you also want to think about what happens when you or a parent or somebody in your family gets to the point where they are not mobile, or they need assistance, or they can't take care of their house, they can't take care of themselves, maybe they can't take care of their significant other. What is the plan for that? Because I know that there are some people and some cultures where it's expected that the more senior people in the family will move in with the younger people, or maybe a younger person will move in with a more senior person. And that's very expected and that's fine, but it's still good to have that conversation. In my case, my dad passed fairly quickly, so we didn't have to really consider that, but my mom needed additional care and she was not willing to go into a facility. And I'm going to talk about that in more depth in caregiving, because that was a whole situation. But she wanted to stay at home. And so we had to find basically 24-hour care for her. Very expensive, very hard to find good care. And it was not something that was talked about at all. And so we had to have those conversations right on the heels of my dad passing. So had I understood what they wanted earlier, it would have been much easier to make some of these decisions. Okay, so I want you to think about, what is the plan? Some people have long-term care insurance. That is definitely an option. I'm not an insurance expert, so you got to talk to your insurance people about that. Some people have the wealth, to take care of themselves and others. That's wonderful. Other people don't. So what is the plan, and do the people that you've included in the plan know about it? Specifically children, family members, all of that. I think one thing that really surprised me in some conversations that I've had with clients and friends is their parents or elderly people in the family just think that somebody's going to take them in. But that's not always the best situation. That's not always what somebody wants. So being able to have those conversations is really important. Along that same line, and I'll talk about this again with the estate planning, but you need to make sure that you have a medical power of attorney. And honestly, everybody needs this regardless of your age. When you go through the estate planning process, your lawyer should do this with you, but you need a medical power of attorney. So basically, if you cannot speak for yourself, who is going to speak for you? Usually, if you are married, so in mine and Danny's situation, if something happens to me, Danny defaults to power of attorney. If something happens to both of us, then I have one of my best friends is my medical power of attorney. And we've talked about that. She knows, we've talked about what I want, and I've also outlined that in the medical power of attorney. So you definitely want to make sure that you have that, just regardless, in case something happens to you. But I think specifically, we have parents and grandparents who are getting up there in years, and when you don't have the medical POA, it can make things very difficult in order to get information, in order to have access, all of that. So definitely consider a medical POA. Think about burial options. This is number 2. This was not something that had been decided by my parents. I thought it had been. It had not. And so I really got blindsided with that decision-making process. And my mom really wasn't in a place to make those decisions. And so I had to step in. I had to pick my dad's casket. I had to put together the whole process, the whole, whatever the service is that you do. I can't think of it right now. And then I had to choose where they were going to be buried. That's very hard. That's very hard to deal with when you are dealing with your parent just dying, and now you have to make a ridiculous amount of decisions. So if you don't have that written out, like in your will, or you haven't had that conversation, have that conversation. I would go even a step further. If there is a certain place you want to be buried, buy those plots. they get more and more expensive. If that's how you want to be, if you want to be buried in a cemetery, get those plots as soon as you can. You can do payment plans for them because they are considered real estate. So for example, we were in Southern California at the time. Plots were very expensive. They're probably more expensive now than they were. So you have to think about that. If you wait, it's a lot of money for somebody else to have to deal with. But it's a lot of decisions. It's a lot of information to have to deal with. And so it's really better if you just take care of that. And again, this is something that I would recommend for everyone. Danny and I actually made some decisions on this based on the experience that we had with my parents. And so we feel really good about the decisions that we made. So just really think about that and how it's going to impact the people around you. And then third, for preparing for death, is think about your stuff. This has been a conversation that I've seen online quite a bit as we're seeing older generations pass away. They have a lot of collectibles, they have china, they have all these different things. And they're expecting us to take them. They're expecting us to deal with it. And that's really not fair. As somebody who had to clean out a 2,500 square foot house that was full of a lot of memorabilia, a lot of I don't even know what you would call them, but just a lot of furniture. It's a lot to have to make choices on those things. My mom passed in January 2018. At the time of this recording, it's November 2023. And it was earlier this year that we finally finished going through everything and making decisions. So 5 years, basically, it took us to go through everything. And I'll be honest, I had to make some decisions about things that I didn't want to make. It was very hard. There were certain things I didn't want to get rid of. It's really hard to make those choices as somebody who is grieving the loss. And so for those who are older, who are still alive, like, have those conversations, figure out who wants what, and either gift it to them now or just let them know, write it down in a list, put it in the will, something like that, so that everybody knows where everything goes. And just declutter, embrace it, declutter, get rid of things. We did an estate sale that was wild. We had so much stuff, and it was so overwhelming. The other thing, and this is really for people who have more like antiques and family heirlooms, get the stories behind pieces that you're keeping. There were quite a few pieces of furniture that I knew my parents had had for probably 50 years or more. And we had an appraiser come because we didn't even know what was real and what wasn't. And I wish I knew the stories behind some of the furniture that they had. I think that would have been really cool. And that was a missed opportunity for me. So definitely find out some of those stories. Some things are worth quite a bit. Some things aren't, but sometimes it's about the memory, and you just want to think about that. Okay. So again, high level, right? I'm not going to go, there are so many more things associated with death, but those are the things that I just want you to think about top of mind as we're having these discussions. Next is estate planning. Let me tell you, if you listen to nothing else in this episode, this is the section to listen to. Estate planning is for everyone. For everyone. It does not matter how old you are. It doesn't matter whether you have kids or not. It does not matter. Everybody needs to do estate planning in some way. Part of the reason for that is if something were to happen to you and you don't have a trust set up, everything that you have goes to probate. Probate is terrible. Probate is terrible. Probate basically means that you are going to court and a judge is going to decide what happens to your stuff and your assets and everything. Even if you don't have that much stuff, a judge is going to decide. If something goes to probate, there is also a chance that somebody can come in and contest it. Anybody can contest it. Family member, a stranger, anybody can contest it. So, and it can take a long time. So to prevent that, you want to put your assets and everything into a trust. I am not going to go into details about trusts because there are different kinds, and it depends on what you have and what makes sense. If you don't have a lot of assets, you still might want to meet with a lawyer. Most lawyers will have like an introductory conversation to see if it makes sense for you to even have a trust. Okay. So I would definitely look into that. But if you own property, if you have any kind of investment accounts like a 401k or something like that, definitely want to look into getting a trust, because that money can get tied up in the process and you won't have access to it, or a significant other or family member won't have access to it. The other thing to consider with a trust, so what'll happen is you'll have your trust, your will be part of the trust. If you only have a will, things will still go to probate. A trust is the only thing that protects your assets. It also helps with taxes. Okay. So you cannot just have a will, you have to put things into a trust. So again, even if you only own a home, you still want that home to be in a trust so that your kids, or whoever is dealing with your estate, I mean, you could be my age and something can happen, but whoever's dealing with your estate, it's much easier. You don't have to go through the probate process because everything is going to be in the trust. Is this confusing? Yes. This is why I'm not going into detail. You have to talk to a lawyer about this. Most trust processes take a couple $1,000s. It depends on how many assets you have and how much has to be prepared and transferred. Okay. So you want to be prepared for that. But it is absolutely worth it, because you do not want your kids to have to deal with the probate process. Along the same lines, make sure that if you have multiple children, that you have everything outlined as to what is going to happen. So if you want to sell if your expectation is to sell your house and have the money split between the 3 kids or 2 kids or however many, then you need to outline that, right? Because what'll happen is you might have one kid that wants to fight for the property and the other kids that don't. And so it becomes very messy. And when you're already dealing with grief and all of that, you don't want to do that. So you want to have everything laid out, and a lawyer will help you do that and then be able to work with whoever the surviving people are. Okay. The other side of the trust process is the financial power of attorney. So our lawyer put together a medical power of attorney and a financial power of attorney in our trust and our will, and all that's all together. The financial power of attorney, I highly, highly, highly recommend, especially if you are older or you have older people in your family, because as soon as mental facilities start to go, you have to have somebody that can step in and take over financially. So they can go to the bank on your behalf, they can transfer money, they can pay bills, they can make phone calls and find out information because they have the power of attorney. Now, obviously, that's a very personal choice of who that is, but make sure it is somebody that you trust wholeheartedly. But definitely need to have that. I had a financial power of attorney for my mom that we put together after my dad passed, and it was a lifesaver for me. It allowed me to make phone calls. It allowed me to talk to the bank. It was very, very helpful. So highly recommend. Okay. Along with estate planning. So let's say you put the trust together, you put the will, you have the POAs, you have all this stuff together. Document everything and then make sure that people know what the plan is. Somebody needs to know. So obviously you're going to have an executor, which is basically somebody who helps manage the trust and manage your wishes after you pass. Okay. But somebody needs to know where to find the information. And I would even say, I think people need to understand what your plan is. And I will tell you why. And not everybody thinks that you should do this. Some people are very private. They don't want anybody to know what their plan is because they don't want to deal with whatever infighting or whatever. I get that. So you have to figure that out for your situation in your family. But I will tell you, having gone through the grieving process, it is much easier to understand what is to happen ahead of time so that you know what to expect and you don't have to make really intense and sometimes expensive decisions while you're in a grief state. Okay, there's a lot of overwhelm that comes after somebody passes. There's a lot of information. There's a lot of feelings. There's a lot going on. When you also get potentially blindsided with additional information about what's to happen with everything, that can make it just that much harder. So document, have conversations, and have the information accessible somewhere where somebody knows where it is. Your lawyer should have a copy, but make sure that people know who the lawyer is so that they can contact them, right? Okay, so documenting and letting people know the plan is number 2 in estate planning. Number 3, which I started to talk about already, is having conversations with family or friends about what you want. I already said this, but it helps in the decision-making process. It sucks to be caught off guard. I will tell you that. We had a couple of things go into probate and it was terrible. The process was terrible and I had no idea. And had I known, I could have mitigated that in advance. And it was a very expensive process and it was a very arduous process. It took a very long time. So just have conversations, please. I know that some of you don't want to have these conversations. I know that it's hard to talk about death and dying. I get it. I absolutely get it. But my experience with my parents forced a lot of conversations that I did not want to have and that even my husband didn't want to have, but we had to have. And since then, I have forced some conversations, even within my friends' families and within some of our extended family, because I don't want people to be caught off guard. I don't want them to have to deal with what I dealt with because it was such a strain emotionally, even physically, because if you are working full time and then you have to deal with somebody's estate, that is like having 2 full-time jobs. It's not a good time. So talk to people, document, keep everything in a place that's easy to find, put everything in a trust. All right. Okay. Last section is caregiving. This is also a very sensitive topic. And I'll be honest, did I make the best choices in my mom specifically with her care? I don't know. We had some really terrible things happen. But I wish that we would have had more conversations about what was to be expected. Okay. So my biggest thing is talk about the options, talk about what is possible, talk about what the family can manage, talk about what the person who specifically is older even wants. Okay. Because there are 3 considerations with caregiving. The finances, how much is it going to cost? The emotional toll, not only on the older person, or sometimes a younger person that something happens to, right? It's not always an older person. But the emotional toll for that person, but also for the family and the person who ends up in a caregiving role. And then time, because I know when after my dad passed, we had to spend a lot more time going to see my mom, and it wasn't for fun. It wasn't just to hang out. It was like we had to deal with things. It was like having a business meeting every couple of weeks because we had to manage so many different things because me specifically, I was responsible for her care. Not only that, but my mom had, I want to say like 2 or 3 different caregivers that came to the house in different shifts. And I was the primary contact. So if something happened, then I got text messages and phone calls. I still worked full time. I had a newborn. Like we had a lot going on, and I was fielding phone calls and texts regularly from caregivers. And so you have to think about that in terms of what needs to happen. Because what I didn't realize at that time was I was essentially their boss. Even though my mom was the one that was there and technically paying their salary and, you know, for their time, her mental facilities were not 100% there. So she requested things, but ultimately I was the one that made the final decisions, which is very hard to deal with, especially when you're not there. And I lived like, I think about 45 minutes away at this time. And so it wasn't like I could just pop over there, you know? And again, remember, we were in Southern California. So traffic, time of day, all that was a thing. If you have to become a caregiver in any capacity, so whether it's how I was, where I was there, but I wasn't physically there, she didn't live with me, but if they live with you or you are having to manage somebody else's care in some way, go to therapy. I wish I had done that. It was one of the things that it was a hindsight. I wish I had done it because I was not dealing with things well. I was very tired. I was emotionally overwhelmed. I was a new mom at the same time. I was working full time. There were a lot of things happening, and I should have been in therapy to manage all of that. And I wasn't. And I'm going to tell you, I definitely lost it a few times because I just couldn't deal with all of the responsibility and all of the decisions that I had to make. Depending on your familial situation, limit contact with people who are toxic. I had some people in my world at that time who were not kind to me about the decisions that I was making and for my mom. And I was doing the best that I could in the situation that I had, but it was very hard. And already being hard on myself and then hearing other people tell me how terrible of a daughter I was not helpful. So if you're in a situation where you know that you have people that are going to be like that, cut off that communication immediately, because it's not worth the time and the emotional strain to have to deal with those people. And then third, in caregiving, this is whether you have people coming to the home or you're in a facility, but you have to be prepared for people, basically strangers, being in your home. So we actually had a caregiver that was hired. We were going through a third-party company, and we had a caregiver that came to our house. We actually loved her. She was wonderful for a very long time. She ended up stealing money from my mom. She ended up stealing cash, stole her wallet, stole her wedding rings. Not even going to talk about that because it's still a sore subject for me. It was a really terrible situation. And I partially blame myself because I did not realize how bad my mom's mental capacity was at that time. It was much worse than she was letting on. And then I was not prepared, right? So all this happened right after my dad passed. And I had never been a caregiver before, and I didn't know what to do, and I didn't know what to think about. I should have removed all of the cash and all the jewelry from my mom's house and taken it. And I didn't do that, and I didn't think about it. So prepare for people, strangers, to be around your loved one. Even if you put them into like some type of facility for them to live, there's still going to be a lot of people around. And I hate to say it, but people are terrible and they will take advantage of the elderly, right? And so, or people who don't have the right mental facilities to be able to fight for themselves, or the physical capabilities to be able to fight somebody or fight back. So if that's a situation that you're in, take away the cash, take away any kind of like family jewelry, anything like that, or put it in a safe where you have the key, something like that, so that you don't have to deal with somebody stealing it. Learn from my mistakes, friends. It's not fun to have to deal with that. Okay, so with caregiving, have conversations, figure out what's possible with the people who need to know. Go to therapy if you end up in a caregiving role, and then have conversations. Prepare for people to be in your home, or for your loved one to be in like a living facility, basically, and put those things under lock and key, or take them to your home. Again, learn from my mistakes. One of the things that I will say with caregiving, depending on the generation of your parents, will depend on how they feel about going into any kind of living facility. So we got to a point with my mom where we wanted to be closer to her, and we couldn't manage traveling. You know, she had been declining mentally for a while, and we just needed more help. And we found a really amazing living facility that was about 20 minutes from us. And we were in the process of getting her a room there. And she went into the hospital. She ended up passing away, so we didn't need the room. But I will tell you, the process of her visiting and coming to terms with potentially being there was a thing. Her generation specifically, if you talk about living not at home, they view it as essentially being locked away. And my mom had a really hard time coming to terms with that. Mind you, this wasn't like some sterile, like hospital looking place. This place was nice. It looked like a hotel. It looked like a 5-star hotel. It was amazing. Like my husband and I joked that we wanted to live there because everything that you needed was there. They drove you to your doctor's appointments. Like they had a nurse practitioner on staff 24/7. They made your meals for you. They dispensed your meds. They did your laundry. They cleaned. Like, this was not a locked away situation. It was an independent living facility. And so they had, you know, activities and trips and all this type of stuff. Now, they did have another side that was for more serious conditions, and your rooms were equipped a little bit different with like different medical devices and things that you might need. But those two sides were separate. So if you were on the independent living side, you didn't really see the people who were on the other side, and vice versa. And so I'm telling you that because if you're in a scenario where nobody can take care of the person, but you can't afford in-home care, which is extremely expensive, putting them into independent living might be the best option, but they might have some issues with it. And so this is part of why I want people to have these conversations, because some people will be like, yeah, let me go live in a facility where there's stuff going on and people cook for me and all of that. Other people will have a very hard time with it. And so you either need time for them to work up to it, or you have to figure out a different alternative, right? Because forcing them is not always going to be the best situation. Okay. I know we went over a lot in this episode, and it's probably wildly longer than I intended, but I wanted to share my experience. I wanted to give you kind of that high level overview again of death, estate planning, and caregiving. I hope that this was helpful for you. If you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. You know, you can message me on LinkedIn, and I always respond there. But I know that these are hard conversations to have. These are hard topics to cover. But I hope that you get something out of it and send it to somebody who needs to hear it so that they can learn from what I went through.